Start the meeting. Oh, it's just come up now, so Mark, you can start.
Bashing. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for joining us. I'd first like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the Council's website. The minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the meeting page of the Council website. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I'd ask all members of the forum who have video cameras to keep their video camera switched on for the duration of the meeting. Ryan, I have noted your difficulties that you're experiencing at the moment, and to keep their microphone muted except when I invite you to speak. Officers will join us to introduce their reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate this by clicking the raised hand function on the right-hand side of your screen. When the chair invites you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question, and then mute it again to allow the officer to respond. I would ask for your patience if we run into technical problems, and should this occur, I might declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed and the public broadcast might be paused. If it's not possible to address the fault, the meeting may be abandoned until such a time as it may be reconvened. Members, we'll begin the meeting as usual with a roll call to establish who is present. When Tamar calls out your name, please confirm your attendance by unmuting your microphone and stating that you are present and the sector or group that you are representing. Over to you, Tamar.
So Mary Abiscara.
It's Abaya Sakira and
sorry.
No worries. Present and Academy Special School.
Alison Anderson.
Present, Academies.
Adrian Ball.
Present, Academies.
Christopher Bennett.
Present, Secondary Academies.
Leslie Birch.
Present, Academy.
Alison Bishop.
Present, Early Years Provider Reference Group.
Yolanda Botham.
Present, Post 16.
Nikki Brown.
Present, Primary Maintained.
John Colpin.
Present, Academies.
Nadine Gooding Herbert. No? Okay. Sasha Howard. No? Ryan Kelsall.
Present, Academies.
Peter Law.
Also present and Academies.
Helena Marsh.
Present, Academies.
Kat Thompson. Mark Vickers.
Present, Alternative Provision Academies.
Charlotte Whistle.
Weissel.
Weissel,
present.
sorry.
It's okay. Maintained Special.
Mark Wood.
Present, Academies.
Helen Brooke.
Present, Unions.
Claire Clark. No. Alan Costello. No. Councillor Claire Daunton.
Present, member of the Children and Young People Committee, County Councillor.
Councillor Farouz Thompson.
Present, Vice Chair of the Children and Young People Committee, Councillor.
Councillor Simone Taylor. No, okay. Martin Purbrick.
Present, County Council.
I've got Sarah Callaghan. Is she managed to get in yet? She's having difficulty joining. I'll make sure that we'll get her in shortly. Martin Wade.
Yeah, sorry, Tamar, she is on screen and she waves.
I mean,
she's here. Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, Martin Wade, Strategic Finance Manager.
Is there anyone else I've missed?
Yeah, Kate Thompson.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Hi, sorry, I was struggling to get in.
That's all right. I've got you.
Hi, Tim. It's Rob Turner. I'm probably standing in for Alan Costello.
Okay, Rob Turner, thank you.
Yeah, John T. Holden, Senior Finance Business Partner, Local Authority.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's everyone, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. We move on, I think, to the appointment of a vice chair. I did check with Tamar that I'm allowed to nominate someone, and I am. So I'm going to nominate Ryan Kelsall. Is there anybody who could second that?
Very happy to second that. And I think, Peter, if you're quick
Yeah,
off the draw, then
likewise.
Okay. Is there anybody else? And thank you for that. There was a race there. So Tamar, I think you can work out whichever one you like as who was the seconder. Is there anybody else who wishes to nominate someone? No. Okay. Rather than going through the whole list of nominating people, I hope it's okay to do it this way around. Is there anybody who would like to express a view that they don't wish Ryan to take on the role of vice chair? No. I was hoping to save you all having to say yes or no. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Ryan, I think that means that you are duly elected as the vice chair. Thank you ever so much. And he did volunteer to do that during the last meeting, just before anybody thinks that we were just stitching him up and not having told him. So thank you very much indeed. Tamar, would you like to report any apologies for absence?
Okay, so apologies received from John Young, Lisa Peacock, and Karen Taylor. Oh, and and also I have apologies from Richard Scott and Karen Scott.
Thank you very much indeed. Move on to the next piece of starting business. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? No, I'm seeing nobody saying anything that looks any different or raising their hands, etc. So thank you. It doesn't matter now about whether we reach those items because there are none. If we can then move on to the minutes of the last meeting, please. Just calling mine up on screen. So we'll take them as we do each time, just through page by page, and just ask if there's anything anybody would like to comment upon or raise anything. If you put your hand up, I'll say the page. If nobody raises their hand, then we'll move on to the next one. Is there anything on page 1? Page 2? 3? 4? 5? And the very small bit that is page 6? No.
What?
Okay. Oh, sorry.
I think
Nikki.
that on page 6, the last, the third point from the end appears to be incomplete, referencing the conversation about a safety valve.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Tamar?
I'll have a look at that and rectify it before you sign. If everyone if that's okay. Let me just have I don't have it right in front of me at this very moment in time. So is that okay, Chair? Or
can you just tell us exactly which point number? Sorry, Nikki, because I'm just trying to follow it. I'm looking at the version that wasn't in the main pack, so I've only got 6 pages, and on the 6th page, I can't see anything that refers to safety valve unless I'm just not very awake this morning.
Sorry, so I'm on page 6, and it's about explaining when entering the safety valve agreement, that paragraph. It's the final, I think it was Sarah Callahan's bit. It says, she explained that the disapplication date had unfortunately fallen before the meeting and it ends there.
Okay. We'll have to look up and see what that is and then check back. Sarah, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I think what it was, Mark, it was, remember, excuse me, when we were making the request for the disapplication, we informed Forum that we had to submit the disapplication in advance of it coming to forum. So that's what it should be referring to. So
okay.
do you remember the discussion? We said we'd had to already, because the date was set in advance, we had to make the disapplication request. However, we were coming to forum to explain the rationale for that.
Okay. Tamar, you're muted. I think you're trying to talk.
Therefore, the words "and that" could be taken out, and there would just be a full stop. Would that be sufficient? No.
I'm just checking. I'm trying to see where Nikki's gone on the screen. There you are, Nikki. Sorry, you moved around a minute ago, and I was thinking, oh dear, where have you gone? Does that sound reasonable, Nikki? Because you're the one who's noted it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It would read. She explained that the disapplication date had unfortunately fallen before the meeting.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Yeah, and then full stop.
Thank you for your detailed reading, Nikki, and thank you for a suitable solution, Tamar. Given those items, are people happy to accept the minutes of the last meeting? Again, I will just look for anybody to... Right, that's smashing. Thank you very much for all those that were nodding. That's very helpful. The completed action log is there also included with the minutes for noting. Unless there's anything else on there, I think we can move forward to the next item. Again, I'm just checking to make sure nobody wants to disagree, which is the proposed dates for future forums. Can I ask Tamar to introduce this report? And again, anybody who wishes to raise anything like you've just done, please raise your hand and I'll do my very best to make sure I spot it.
Yeah, it's just very straightforward. It's the report's proposing the dates going forwards. And does anyone have any queries, questions? Has anyone spotted an error? I don't know if anyone had any comments on the dates, proposed dates. Chair? No?
It would not appear so at this point,
That's
Tamar.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much then. Thanks.
And we're happy to accept that as everybody's not said anything. So brilliant. Thank you very much again for those nodding. We'll move on, therefore, on to the main item, I think, the school's budget setting. That's Martin and Sarah. Members will note that this report was circulated to the forum on the 8th of January. Can I please ask Martin and Sarah to introduce the report? They'll take us through a presentation setting out different proposals and decisions required by forum. There'll be a chance to ask questions after each section of the presentation. So thank you very much, and over to you, Martin and Sarah.
Thank you, Mark. So hopefully I'll put the presentation on screen, so please let me know when you can see that. So yeah, again, apologies for the lateness of this report coming out, but as you'd appreciate, the figures from the DFE weren't published until the 18th of December, which meant we was then working to try and produce the figures to be able to share with you the very latest position for this meeting. So I'll take you through the kind of the main sections, and as Mark said, obviously, if there are any queries or questions, please, we'll pause at each section for you to be able to ask any comments in terms of that. So obviously, yeah, figures were published on the 18th of December, and in terms of the initial DSG allocations and the links there to the detail, for any of you that want to look at all of the accompanying documents that were published alongside the initial figures for 2025-26. So the table on this slide shows the kind of the comparison between 24-25 allocations and the 25-26 allocations. Please note the figure highlighted in red is changed slightly from the figure that was in the originally circulated presentation. This is because we've updated it to reflect the revised baseline figures for the grants which are being included in the 25-26 allocation. So we've included the 24-25 figures comparatively, so that it shows what the actual real difference is between those 2 years. So as you can see, what that does mean is that actually there's a very minimal uplift between 2024-5 and 25-26 in terms of the schools block, and I'll kind of explain the reasons for that shortly. High needs block has increased by 7%. As we said previously, 7% is the floor in terms of the minimum uplift that any local authority can receive. So obviously that is the kind of the position for us, which is obviously a £7.5 million increase, although welcomed is nowhere near sufficient to meet the increases in costs and pressures that we're seeing on an annual basis. Central services block, as we've spoken about previously, that continues to reduce slightly year on year as funding for historic commitments reduces. And then obviously there's a considerable increase in the early years block due to the extended entitlements which are coming into that particular service area. So a considerable amount of additional investment and funding going into early years, which again we'll talk about later. So as I mentioned, minimal uplift for the schools block. Primarily that's because of a net reduction in pupil numbers between 2023 and 2024. I think that's the first time I can ever recall us having a net reduction in pupils across both phases. In terms of that, quite considerable decreases in the primary phase, offset in part by increases across secondary in terms of that. Early years block data, which I've already mentioned, they're only indicative figures at the moment. Based on January 2024 data sets, the early years block changes on a termly basis based on take up, so that figure will flex as we go throughout the next financial year. Interestingly, details of a lot of the other grants which we would expect to have been published by this stage are yet to be so. So obviously there's some quite big chunks of missing information there when schools start to consider some of their budget setting in terms of those additional funding streams, which are still going to be outside of the main funding formula. So taking the figures that we received at the end of December, we've then kind of reflected on the conversations that we've spoken about previously at Schools Forum and applied some detailed modelling scenarios based on £2 million centrally retained growth fund, aligning our funding with the national funding formula and trying to apply the 0% minimum funding guarantee. As yet, we've still not received the outcome of our original disapplication request in terms of the block transfer, and equally we'll touch on that shortly in terms of a further request to Schools Forum. So in order to kind of facilitate those conversations and being as transparent as possible, what I've done is created 4 different scenarios in terms of the funding to show what the impact would be at different levels of potential block transfer. So this table summarizes the kind of what that would mean at each level of block transfer, from 0% in scenario 1 up to the kind of the 1.25% in scenario 4. So straight away you can see on scenario 4, if we were to take a 1.25% block transfer, actually we would be in breach of the ESFA's minimum factor values. So as part of their move towards a national funding formula, each local authority is given a minimum and maximum range of values that they can apply to each of the formula factors in the local formula factor. The 1.5% block transfer, which would be equate to around £6.5 million, which would mean we were in breach of that. So effectively, that is an unaffordable model. So we've effectively taken that off the table in terms of that. The other 3 models in 1, 2, and 3 are affordable in terms of the model, but again I'll talk a little bit more about them as we kind of move through the presentation. But as you can see, the kind of the level of uplifts that would mean in terms of the baselines at scenario 3 would equate to a 0.6% uplift, scenario 2 1.1%, and scenario 1 1.6% uplift are still very low in terms of uplifts to overall schools budgets. So accompanying this, obviously sent out the Appendix B, which is the kind of the more detailed spreadsheet in terms of individual modelling at individual school level. I don't know, Chair, whether it's worth me putting that up on the screen just to kind of explain what it shows in more detail.
I think it's always useful, Martin, just Better to give us the detail than leave us asking questions in a minute.
No problem. I'm just going to test my abilities on Zoom now. So I'll end the slideshow and then bring the that presentation up. So bear with me a second in terms of that.
We have every faith, Martin.
Yeah, I'm glad somebody does, Mark. Yeah. I've got so many things open though that I can't actually find the spreadsheet that I'm looking for. Right, here we go. So hopefully you can now see the Appendix B. Please let me know if you need me to make it any bigger in terms of the screen. So effectively what this shows for the each of the 4 scenarios that we've got is in the green columns is the baseline figures. So effectively based on last year's formula, what the school's funding allocation was. I've then added in the additional grants baseline figures, which effectively show what then the DFE have then added into the funding for 25-26. So effectively, we end up with a 24-25 baseline, including those additional grants for each school. Then for each of the scenarios, scenario 1, which is a 0% block transfer, scenario 2, 0.5, and so on, effectively showing what each of the funding allocations would be for each individual school based on those initial draft illustrative figures that we've produced. So as you can see, for those schools which are showing having reductions in pupil numbers, which you can see at the start of the in the columns on the left, quite a lot of those schools, regardless of the scenario, would see a reduction in cash funding year on year. And what you would actually find what you'd actually see for a lot of these, that those figures don't actually change too much because of the way in which the minimum funding guarantee and the minimum per pupil level protections apply to the different factors within the formula. However, what you do see is, as if in the scenarios where we take or proposing taking a higher block transfer, what you find is those schools who have potentially gained in some of the lower block transfer proposals would see reductions in those gains in the kind of in the later scenarios, as the overall affordability of the formula has to be taken into consideration. So it tends to be those schools who have historically had funding in excess of the minimum per pupil levels would see a lesser reduction than other schools. So it would effectively equalise across the piece. As I say, I think probably the biggest concern, regardless of the scenarios, is for those schools with a falling roll and the impact that that's going to have on terms of their actual funding in future years. Then for each of the scenarios, there's a factor values tab, which shows essentially what the factor value would be at each of the levels. So the principle remains the same for each of these tabs. The green column, it shows what the funding formula rates were in 24-25. The columns D, E, and F show the figures from the DFE, and then the minimum and maximum allowable values. And then one with column G highlighted in yellow shows the different percentage block transfers, what those unit rates would have to be weighted at to effectively meet overall affordability. And as I said, in scenarios A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3, for the 0%, 0.5%, and 1%, we're all above the minimum allowable values. But if you go to the 1.25%, you can see that actually the unit rates that we would have to apply come below the minimum values, so they're not allowable within the national guidance in terms of what we are and aren't allowed to do. Then final 4 tabs on this show the detail at school level of every formula factor, and I'm sure you've all looked at this in great depth, but shows every formula factor for every school and how that applies across each of those in terms of there. I think what I find interesting on this is the minimum per pupil levels and the cost of meeting the minimum per pupil levels and the MFG at each of the different rates. So if we were to take no block transfer, for example, the cost of meeting the minimum per pupil levels is 1.3 million, and the funding to meet the MFG would be 400,000. So again, those flex depending on the overall protections. Because of the changes in the national funding formula, we are limited in terms of what we can actually do now in terms of the protections, and because of the way it links in, our local flexibility is, as I say, is more limited than it was previously on that. But as I say, hopefully that gives the kind of, probably too much detail, but it gives the detail of how the formula is being assessed and the different scenarios that we've used to get to that point in terms of that. Okay, I'll go back to the presentation.
Thank you, Martin. And I think that really does show how when you push in one place, another one pops up, and how that interaction works.
Yeah, it does.
Terrifyingly
indeed.
confusing, I think, and makes it very difficult for any of us to be able to argue with a lot of the time. Yeah,
that's my intention, Mark. So
I wasn't suggesting it was your intention, Martin. I was suggesting it may be somebody. Yes.
No, you're right. I mean, it is, and I think, as I say, I think the key is now actually, but as we move more towards the national funding formula, the flexibilities that we have within the local approach are more limited than they have been previously. So as I say, as you said, and it is very key, noticeable, especially when the uplift is tight and there's not as high as it has been in previous years, that the impact on MFG, minimum per pupil levels, and then what that then does to schools at individual level is markedly noticeable compared to some years when we've had a slightly higher uplift as well. Yeah. Right, I'll move back to the presentation now. I'm just trying to, again, too many things open. Bear with me. Right.
No problem.
There we go. Right. So I think we've got to this slide, haven't we? Yeah. So so effectively that shows us the kind of the summary of the kind of the detail that I've just taken through in the Appendix A. Right, so moving on, so I've taken you through the what each of the tabs in Appendix B shows us. So just in terms of the kind of a couple of other points on this, variations to pupil numbers have been applied to new and growing schools, as we mentioned last time. As I've already said, factor values have been scaled to meet overall affordability. Sparsity and split site values have been set at the maximum permissible amounts, and the school level allocations will vary dependent on individual school circumstances. So for sparsity, there's the distance criteria as well, and split site as well now has a distance criteria which applies to that as well. And as with previous years, there are a couple of things which are kind of outside of the kind of the formula allocations. So PFI, for example, and we've got still 5 schools which qualify for exceptional premises factors, which are kind of just on an actual funding basis rather than on a formulaic basis. So this is the current variation of pupil numbers which have been applied in terms of the figures which I've just shared with you, in terms of looking at guaranteed numbers for the next academic year. I think in most cases we either had conversations with individual schools or trusts, or place planning colleagues will be in the next few days, and so there might still be a couple of changes on those, but they're already factored in to the funding allocations which I've shared with you. Business rates, again, all of our districts have signed up to the ESFA central business rates process, which means maintained schools will continue to not have to pay bills directly, and therefore they won't receive funding for that purpose. Again, as we've done in previous years, we will include the notional amount within the kind of the budgets when we send them out, but the schools just need to be mindful, as it has been for academies for quite some time, that actually these will be paid centrally, and you won't actually see the funding directly. So still a bit of a change for maintained schools, as this is only the second year that's being the case. Okay. So as noted on the earlier slides, we're still waiting for the disapplication request, in which we submitted to the ESFA up to 1.25%. But as I've already mentioned, we've already established that 1.25% wouldn't be viable because of overall affordability within the formula. Equally, when we've looked at the figures, I'm very much of the view that actually 1% is also deemed to be unviable because of the impact that that would have on individual schools and the minimal uplift that we've received on the overall schools block. However, following the conversations at last forum, we would ask schools forum to reconsider a block transfer of 0.5%, which would be used to support the creation of enhanced resource bases to kind of avoid escalation into more expensive provisions. So on the next couple of slides, I've added a little bit more information, which again wasn't in the packs, which was original packs, which was circulated to you. But we've started to kind of look at some illustrative examples of the potential costs of ERBs, what the kind of the place funding will be. For example, if we created 10 new ERBs of between 8 and 10 pupils each, and what that potential cost avoidance would be based on the ability to move children off existing packages, or to kind of the cost avoidance because of they wouldn't be escalated into those more expensive packages. And based on some initial work, and again there's a further slide on this, based on some initial work, we estimate that to be about £30,000 to £40,000 per pupil per annum based on that. So the cost differential between a tuition placement or an out-county independent placement compared to keeping them in an ERB place would be quite a significant saving or cost avoidance. I think what we have to accept is that overall numbers and complexity of need are going to continue to increase, which means costs are going to continue to increase. But I think this is more around trying to kind of make that incline less steep than it would have been if we didn't do these kind of investor save proposals in terms of the overall numbers. So based on some work Matt Beek from the Ed Sykes team has done around that, looking at some, what those 2 or 3 ERBs, SMEH ERBs that we've opened within the last few months. And there's some kind of per pupil examples of around some illustrative examples of costs for pupils or what was being looked at prior to them going into an ERB and the cost differentials for those individual pupils, and the benefits for those individual pupils as well in terms of being in an inclusive environment within mainstream school settings as well. So there's 3 different examples there, and obviously we'll circulate this revised slide deck round so you can see this in more information as well in terms of that. So I think there's been some real positives with the kind of ERBs which have recently opened in terms of both outcomes for the young people and, from my perspective, a cost saving compared to the alternative, which was either being delivered or being sought in terms of that. We do recognise, though, that there obviously is a lot of work that needs to be done to develop this. And obviously, as part of this, with the high needs block subgroup, we want to work with that high needs block subgroup to develop the proposals around ERBs, the governance arrangements. There is definitely a review of the costings and finances that needs to be undertaken around that based on some of the feedback from the new ERBs and existing ERBs which are in place, and look at that. So I think they're kind of the approach we want to take there. I'll pause there and let Sarah or Martin come in if there's anything they want to add on that specifically.
Thank you, Martin. I think you've illustrated the cost benefits, haven't you? And I guess alongside that, obviously, you can see the differential in terms of costs, because the examples that we've included would have typically cost around 45,000, 50,000 a place, whereas in the ERB model, we're looking at more of 15,000 a place with the place funding and top up. Obviously, the top up will vary. So if you look back to the 0.5%, which is around about the equivalent of 2.7, if you multiply that cost avoidance of 1, which is typically around 250,000, if you compare the costs, if those children's needs were being met in specialist provision or through alternative provision and being delivered alternatively in a ERB, the cost saving for each one is around about 250,000. So if we were to do 10, it's around about 2.5 million, which is in line with that reduced 0.5% disapplication figure that we're proposing today. But obviously we do want to work with you around this, and that's why further on the agenda we have submitted those terms of reference for the high needs block subgroup, and as Martin said, that's where we will be much more transparent in terms of how we work that model up to ensure that where those new ERBs are placed, the physicality is right, the model is right, the ethos is right, and critically the placement of those children is right. So I think there's a strong rationale to support, the further rollout of those ERBs based on the financial modelling, but also on the impact of those children.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'll move on, and then we can come back to that at the end of this section. So Appendix C is the proposed growth fund policy to be applied for 25-26. No significant changes from the policy that we applied last year, other than some clarity around the process in the sections, and equally the uplift in funding to align with the DFE's guidance on growth funding. In terms of the amounts, we're basing ours on an additional class, because obviously we're saying that actually where schools are needing to make structural changes to meet basic need, they are going to have to put in on additional classes, and this applies obviously to both maintained schools and academy schools in the same way, albeit academies get the funding for the full academic year, and maintained schools will receive a 7/12 element for the period from the September through to the March. Done some work with place planning on this, and we are confident that the centrally retained growth fund can remain at £2 million. This pot of money just funds the growth funding and also the diseconomies funding. But as I say, we've done some initial analysis, and despite the slight increase in the funding rates, we're confident that the 2 million is sufficient to meet the costs in terms of that. What's interesting is the allocation we've received from government for growth funding has reduced this year. Not unsurprising given our net reduction in overall pupil numbers, but it's still kind of in line with what we would expect in terms of growth for the following year. Most of that growth is in the secondary phase, as you'd expect, as those numbers continue to increase and come through, although there are still a handful of primary schools which are experiencing expansion and growth to support new communities and additional basic need as well. I think it's the last bit on this section before I take comments. So notional SEN. So as in previous years, every local authority is required to identify a notional budget for mainstream schools around SEN. I think it's important to remember that the notional SEN is not a separate formula factor or a funding allocation, so it doesn't generate funding in its own right. Effectively, it is a percentage of the individual funding factors. And as you can see, based on currently in 24-25, based on the percentages set out at the bottom of that slide, DFE have subsequently published some additional guidance, which is interesting in terms of some of the changes. So effectively, we've kind of been following it to a certain extent, but they've now been much more explicit that they think that the majority of the whole of the low prior attainment factor funding should be form part of the DFE, part of the notional funding rather. And I think the biggest single change is this bottom paragraph on this, where they've said that basically there's going to be an exercise to look at the notional SEN budget to ensure that it provides schools with £1,800 per pupil identified as on SEN support, having taken into consideration that the £6,000 per pupil for HCPs. We're not exactly sure what that means in practice, in terms of what that's actually going to do in terms of that. But it's something obviously we need to be mindful of going forward, as it does suggest a kind of the DfE have threatened for a few years now moving towards a national notional SEN approach, and this is potentially a first step of that in terms of that kind of process. So attached Appendix D, which gives us, and we provided this previously, which provides some comparative data with other local authorities and how they calculate their notional SEM. Based on the 24-25 budget submissions, and we were still considerably lower than most of our statistical and regional neighbours, and therefore, based on the revised DfE guidance, we're proposing to increase the notional SEN to align with those kind of the national position and also the kind of our statistical and geographical neighbours. So increasing our prior attainment to 100% from the figure it's currently at, but equally then reducing down the percentage of the basic entitlement slightly as well, and this would result in a slight uplift in terms of the percentage in terms of that. Again, until we fully understand what this means in terms of the DfE statement around the kind of the checks they're doing here, we're not quite sure what that actually means in practice in terms of that. So you'll be pleased to hear that's the end of that section. I'm afraid still quite a few more bits to come, but obviously we'll pause there, take comments, questions in terms of that, and then obviously there's a couple of things we'd like you to approve and vote on as set out on this slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much as ever for the detail and the clarity, Martin. I will just wait until I can see if anybody. I see a hand has gone up from Mary. Mary, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, Martin. I'd be interested to understand how KPIs could be put alongside the kind of financial implications of the model that you've put forward, because we know that enhanced resource provisions do get funded very differently, and we've got a disparity of the funding currently in Cambridgeshire of enhanced resource provisions. I understand that that's because they meet a range of needs, but we do need to be assured that any transfer to a high needs block is being effective in its use, and that we have some clarity around what those KPIs are. Also, on the note of the notional SEND funding, you and I have had this discussion before, and therefore you understand that, you know, part of notional SEND and the point of notional was always that we can kind of create what should be ordinarily available in schools, and therefore that figure of the 1,800 has become yet another arbitrary figure, and it actually does schools a disservice if they are being creative around ordinarily available, and therefore slowing down that, or being creative in how they meet need without the need for an EHCP. So there is the potential that we could do badly by schools who are being creative and therefore slowing down the kind of tidal wave into EHCPs if we don't consider how we KPI the use of notional around what is ordinarily available provision in schools. So I think there needs to be the work around the KPIs for the provision of ERPs, but also those KPIs around how is notional spent, and therefore have we got schools who are more inclusive. And the reality is we have got a lot of schools who, because they are inclusive and because they have a high quality ordinarily available provision, have more children on that SEN register. We could end up with the over-identification of SEN, and actually that would increase the tidal wave towards EHCP. So we need to be mindful of it in the round and the whole picture. So there's a couple of questions there, one around the notional budget and one around KPIs.
Yeah, No, I think you're exactly right, and I think as part of the work we spoke about doing in the subgroup, I think that kind of the KPIs around the ERBs, looking around the governance, and I think Sarah's just said exactly that in the chat in terms of that. I think that would be a key part of the work with that group around modelling that. I think the point you made around the differentials in funding is key as well around the ERBs, and again, I think that's something that we could use that group to do, and I'm sure Ryan wants to come in on that specific point as well. In terms of that, in terms of the notional, yeah, I agree. I think there is some work we need to do that. We already do some kind of analysis and can obviously look at where schools have a higher percentage of SEND support and of EHCPs and are being more inclusive in other schools. But I think you're right. It's around, again, that's probably some data we can share with the subgroup around looking at that and just trying to understand what that actually means in practice across the county really, and in the impact on those individual schools.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I like the way you almost like a teacher, Martin. You already made it very simple for me to now introduce Ryan's question.
Yeah, just some comments probably and a question. So I think Mary's point around the notional and how that links to ordinary available provision is a really valid one. I think it also links into how we support and challenge schools to ensure that they're delivering on ordinary available provision, and that alongside the notional there's also that bit of what we should be doing. And I think the direction of travel everyone is seeing it is that mainstream schools are going to be expected via the new Ofsted framework and other things to be really delivering on that. So that will be something we can talk about. I think my second comment is I welcome that the fact that we've actually got some clarity about what any funding that's voted on being moved across is going to be dedicated to. And I think that's a really important first step. And that leads on to Mary's other point, that having made that important first step and said in this group, this is what we're going to use this funding for, developing those KPIs. So what we've been asking for a number of years can really be measured this time next year is going to be a really important piece of work. So I think there's some work to do, but I think outlining that we're prioritising the ERBs with this money and setting up a group that is going to work specifically on that is a positive step forward.
Thank you kindly, Ryan. Sarah, was this a response to Ryan that you put your hand up for? Is it something that can appear later?
It is a response to Ryan, Mark, and also to Mary's points. It's in terms of the quality assurance of the ordinarily available. And I think to manage the risk of what Ryan and Mary are raising, in that, there could actually be a perverse incentive of raising the prevalence of requests for EHCPs and additional support, if we use the high needs block subgroup to cross-reference the trend over time in terms of EHCPs and referrals for EHCPs against the demography and the context within those individual schools, and where we're seeing that there's a real difference, i.e. the complexity of that school doesn't tally with the numbers of EHCPs, for instance, that will help within that quality assurance process. So I think that's why we need to work that up together within that high needs block subgroup, because I think the points that Mary and Ryan have made are very valid.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Leslie, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you, everybody. No, agree with what you're all saying, and these might just be pointers, some of them thinking about future. It'd be really interesting to see pupil numbers in the different areas of Cambridgeshire and also the SEND need, so we could look at where the pressures are and where the gaps are. That would be really useful, I think. Also, completely agree about the KPIs, etc. And I think on the ground, how are we going to support schools where they have got that good provision and not being overloaded, and how can we sort of monitor that and I suppose police it at sort of a local level, so that we're supporting our schools and they're not becoming the go-to schools. And then the other thing is just, and I know I've spoken to Martin about this, but are we looking at our IDACI factors, because we've got a lot of growing areas in Cambridgeshire, so therefore, you know, our funding is less than it should be, and are we pursuing this and what that's looking like for the future?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on a couple of those if you like. As I say, yeah, in terms of pupil numbers, yeah, I mean, I think we've probably got all that data, and we can speak to colleagues around providing that to Forum and to the subgroup as well around pupil numbers and SEN numbers, and see what they've got around forecasts. So we can take that away as an action, as something that we can produce in terms of that. In terms of IDACI, I've contacted the DfE a couple of times about this, as to try and get an indication as to when they're going to update the IDACI information, because obviously, as you say, as we got more and more new communities, that data very quickly becomes outdated in terms of that. So again, I'll follow that up again in terms of that. I don't think it's going to be a quick answer in terms of them turning it around, but we do have a little bit of flexibility where we think the IDACI is completely out of line to be able to try and apply some averages. So for example, for new schools where there isn't any IDACI data, we can apply either the county average or the average of schools in the surrounding area. So there are some flexibilities we can do around that, but unfortunately it tends to be that most of the data is out of date, so it doesn't always necessarily do, but we do recognise that that is an issue because of the time lag on that IDACI data.
Thank you very much. Martin, am I to presume you're going to come in on this point? Martin Purbrick?
Yeah, just a very quick point, just to add on to what Martin Wade was saying, that I think you're right to identify the data as critical, and that it will be using that data and analysing it, which would help us decide where is best placed, along with the schools that are looking to have an ERB, but analysing the data so that we get sort of the best bang for our buck and the best outcomes for those children, because we know that everyone on here wants the children to attend their local school, and if we can look at where most children are not able to do that, but they need to have an ERB, then using that data will help us get to that position.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Both Martins indeed. Nikki, I think yours is the next hand.
Oh, yeah, thank you. It's just some feedback in terms of the discussions that were had at the CPH meeting. Obviously, after the last meeting where we didn't reach an agreement around a transfer, it's just to share the feedback from heads that there are some very real concerns around the potential implications on schools' capacity to deliver ordinarily available provision if we are talking about moving more money out of school budgets, and the sense that whilst I understand the modelling that you've done, shows that picture of the financial benefit, they are children who are already out of school on tuition packages. So if we are suggesting that we move more money out of school budgets, I think we have to acknowledge that there is a very real danger that what will then happen is we will have more children who are not able to receive the support that they need to stay in mainstream school, and then will end up out of school and into tuition packages, and that cycle goes around. And there was a very strong sense from primary heads that we have reached that point where schools are already having to make cuts. I was sat on a fair access panel this week for a young person who is out of school on an exclusion, and every single primary school that was sat there was saying that they were unable to afford the level of support that that young person had had in the existing school, and even with that support had then ended up in an exclusion. So I think whilst the figures look great, and I understand the figures kind of paint a great picture, I think it's also about acknowledging that there will be other knock-on effects, and primary heads are very keen that that voice is heard, that whilst we absolutely want to support the development of those ERBs, I think it would be naive to think that if we transfer money out of schools block into the high needs block, that we aren't going to see another knock-on effect of that.
Thank you, Nikki. I think, Martin, your hand was just ahead of Sarah's, and I presume again it's to come back to Nikki's points.
Yeah, it is. I don't know whether we're going to say the same thing, but just a very quick point for me. I think it would probably be a combination of young people. I don't think it would just be moving young people that are already on expensive packages. I think it would be a combination of children that are like the child that you just described, who was actually in school but struggling, but also other children. So it's a bit of cost avoidance and saving, but it would probably be based on on the children that are in that area and already in that school. I don't know if that was the same thing Sarah was going to say.
Yeah, more or less, Martin. But I was also going to say, I think you make a good point, Nikki, that ERBs in isolation will not be the entire solution to this, will they? For all the points that you've made. So ERBs is part of the solution in terms of enabling those children to remain in mainstream, but accessing specialist support. But alongside that, we do need to also look at the support offered to our mainstream schools more broadly, working with our health partners, because one of the successes of the ERB model is that therapeutic thinking that's underpinning it. And I think nationally, they haven't all worked because there hasn't been that investment into the model itself. And I think some of the things that are informing and shaping that support in the ERBs needs to also extend to schools more broadly. So there's a broader piece of work around the commissioning and the support to schools to enable them to support children to remain in mainstream where they can. So it's part of the solution, but not the whole picture.
Thank you, Martin and Sarah. Helen, if it's okay, I'm just going to check with Nikki whether her point is coming back to what's just being discussed.
Yeah, it was. Sorry, if I can just come back to what Sarah was saying. I think it's really good to hear, Martin, that we are talking about a broad range of children. But I think it's also about, it's not simply to do with an approach or a philosophy. It's about the boots on the ground. So when that child is going back into, when we are being asked as mainstream primaries to take those children in, I sat in that meeting yesterday. That child is currently on a tuition package, which is costing many thousands of pounds. There was a school that was potentially willing to take that young person in, but the acknowledgement that they needed an additional adult. But at the Fair Access panel, we were told there was no additional funding available to any school taking one of those children in. So I think it's really important that we have something beyond just sketching out what those ERBs might look like that involves, for example, Claire Cook's team and looking at their budget before we would be in a position to be able to agree as primary heads group.
Thank you, Nikki. Sarah, again, I presume you're coming back to Nikki.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I totally agree with what Nikki's saying. And I think the wider piece of the Inclusion for All framework has to also review the top-up funding and the support to schools in its entirety. And that is what we want to explore within that high needs block subgroup. But I think what was proposed, what we're sharing today is that part of that solution, which is impactful and we can demonstrate will save money, is the ERB model, but it isn't the solution in its entirety, but it is part of it. And regardless of whether those children were on AP and were already out of school, we were paying for them to access their education, and the costs associated with that were greater. So the model makes sense from that perspective, but also for the outcomes for the children. But as Nikki said, it's not the entire solution.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your patience, Helena.
That's okay. Sort of a question, a clarification, and maybe coming back to the implications as well. I see the rationale behind the 2.6 million sort of invest to save approach. And I appreciate the modelling around, you know, the 10 young people for whom that would show a good use of that investment. Are we confident that there's feasibility in the timescale with which to achieve that, because I'm conscious we've got 6 months really in this school year before we're looking at next budget to work through some of the existing challenges to actually implement this infrastructure. And we've heard quite a lot about the complexity. Is there kind of the capacity and the pace in which to drive this agenda? Because for £2.6 million, it's still quite high level. There's not a huge amount of detail at the moment in terms of what I can see, the timeline for that implementation. And meanwhile, thinking about the reality, like Nikki was suggesting, I think particularly coming from the perspective of a school with a falling role, who's already having to trim budgets, my concern would be if we make this transfer and if that has the real impact of, let's say, 30, 50, 70,000 pounds at school level, in reality, schools are having to consider redundancies, not replacing people, and they may be the very people who are working with vulnerable children pastorally in inclusion teams, delivering, SEND provision. So I'm just very conscious that, we need to be confident in that model realising itself, I guess, in the next budget year to make that investment worthwhile.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And just waiting to see if any of the officers like to respond, or yeah, Sarah, please feel free.
Sorry, Mark. I was, I mean, obviously, I think that the points are well made, and the physicality of the schools to be able to host an ERB is part of that consideration, and the time frame will be shaped by that to a certain extent, won't it? So it's a combination of the physicality of that, the school, the sites, the access, the implication for transport, but also then the level of investment required. And there is a timeline that's shaped by that. And obviously it's a tight time frame. But I think what we're illustrating today is the potential, but it's also about exploring those other options, as Nikki's talked through, around how do we also support schools to better manage need, so that this isn't seen to be a solution on its own, because it won't be immediate. It has to be part of a wider reconsideration around the top-up funding and how that could be allocated proportionate to need, so that schools are able to manage children to remain with the right support. So I think the timeline is ambitious, but it's part of a wider package, and we need to work that up through that high needs block subgroup based on the factors that I've just alluded to.
Thank you very much indeed. John.
Thank you, Mark. And it's really sort of, I'm not sure it's a question or whether it's more a sort of statement, because it really builds on various points of other colleagues and Sarah's point just then. I mean, I would say that I welcome the actual targeted use of the funding if we do make that decision to approve a 0.5% transfer. I think we've been arguing for a while that we actually want to follow the money, so we can actually see that we're getting bang for the buck in that sort of sense. So I think that's a step forward. I would completely echo what's saying, that actually it's not the solution completely. We have to think about actually what is our vision for inclusion, and making sure that everybody's signed up to the same principles around inclusion. We've spoken before about the importance of working with parents, the quality of training, and so on. I suppose that two things I would sort of pick up. One is to make sure that actually if there's an expectation upon getting ordinary available provision right, and absolutely the case, then we also need to think where the limits of that actually are, and having clarity about, okay, so what are the expectations around a school, and when actually is a school's obligations exhausted, and making sure we have that level of clarity. My other point, which is more of a question to Sarah and I suppose also to Ada Martin, really, is that assurance that we have have the capacity in the local authority and across the system to deliver this change, because we've all sat here before when we've made these transfers to meet the demands of the safety valve and the SEND transformation programme, and that they weren't delivered on because of difficulties in the local authority in terms of having the capacity to deliver those programmes. Is there anything that can be said to us today to just assure us that actually, in terms of the workforce in the local authority to deliver the ERB programme, that's going to be supported and developed. So in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, monitored by the High Needs Working Group, we are confident that actually we're on track to deliver the ERB programme. So perhaps Sarah, perhaps you can come back to me on that one.
Yeah, so you're right. There are significant capacity issues across the teams, and we know that that's impacting on schools. And we know that the current offer of support is not good enough in terms of our timeliness that's been exacerbated by those capacity issues. But on a very positive note, we have had funding allocated. We've had a further 500,000 allocated on a temporary basis that is above the establishment costs. And we have got funding earmarked for the new financial year also that will support some of those capacity gaps. So we do feel confident that there is funding that is going to enable us to drive this forward, albeit, you know, as nationally, there is particular areas, educational psychologists for one, where there are, you know, national issues in terms of recruitment. But there is support. It's recognised within the local authority that there's pressures on the team, and we have had additional funding allocated based on that.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm just checking whether there are any other. Martin.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and on top of that, there's a piece of work going on at the moment looking at how we, the structure that we've got, where our staff are, and how we can best support the delivery of the statutory assessment team, and incorporated in that will be the ERBs. So there's, as Sarah summarised, there is, you know, earmarks, assuming that our members vote to support the budget, some additional investment next year, on top of the additional investment that was made this year. Plus, there's a big piece of work going on to look at our structure and make sure it's fit for purpose and is providing the most efficient service, because we know that it isn't at the moment. It's not supporting schools and it's not supporting families as best as it could do, and that's causing frustration in the system. So we want to make sure that it does, certainly for the start of the next academic year. So that piece of work is going on at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. I have a couple of my own, if that's okay. First one, and I don't mind which officer would like to respond to it. I'm looking first at required action C. What are the implications for the local authority in terms of how this might be perceived by the DfE, or indeed for your own actions, if we were to vote no to C today?
So if you were to vote no to C today, as we haven't yet had the disapplication response from the DfE, I'm not quite sure. So our view as officers would be 0.5%. If Forum voted no, but then the disapplication that we've already submitted came back and said yes, it would be a local decision, but our officer view would be to go at 0.5%. If you voted no and the disapplication came back no, we would be unable to transfer the 0.5%, because obviously that would not have been approved by either yourselves or the DfE as part of our disapplication. Obviously, that would then have significant implications for the rollout of the ERB programme, and the kind of the savings associated with that. It would obviously add significant deficit to the overall high needs block. As we said before, unfortunately the timings on this are not great, and as we've not had a response yet, it's difficult to know the kind of the next steps. I don't know if Sarah or Martin have anything to add on that.
I'm happy to add something. I just think it would be disappointing, because I think there's an opportunity here which, I mean, I haven't been around for an awfully long time, and you will all know the history of Cambridgeshire education and the relationship with the local authority regarding SEND for longer than I do, and you'll know the history much better. But I do think this is an opportunity for us to do something together, rather than just transferring the money to the local authority and then not having a partnership approach to it. I think this is an opportunity for us all to look at how we can work together to design where things are, where they're going to be, and what the KPIs are, as we've already discussed, and what the benefits will be. And we're talking all about the money because I know this is the school's budget bit, but I think probably the thing that us all as practitioners would be really interested in is the soft benefits of those children being able to attend their local schools, which I know from conversations with many people in here is what all head teachers want for children in their local area to go to their school. And I think this is an opportunity to make sure that some of those children that may not have that opportunity, or that opportunity is diminishing because they're finding it so difficult at the moment. It would be a shame if that didn't happen, but we would have to respect the decision of the forum.
Thank you, Martin. Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I totally agree with everything both Martins have said, but I suppose just going back in terms of the credibility with our schools, I do think that now that we've agreed to have this high needs block subgroup and have much greater transparency around the spend and the application of that spend, and having the KPIs that we've all just discussed, I think, as Martin said, if the disapplication doesn't happen, the pressure just gets pushed. You know, the children are still there. The children still require access to education, and we are all responsible for ensuring that that happens. But obviously, schools like the local authority are experiencing their own pressures. But if we have that greater transparency around what are the KPIs, how many children are we supporting, what are the costs associated with that, and what are what's the impact of the spend? If we can get to that place within that high needs block subgroup, I think there will be greater confidence across the system, won't there? So it's unfortunate we're at this position right now, but it's positive that we've made that agreement to work collaboratively, where we will be able to see where the spend is and what the impact of that spend is. So I'm hopeful that that will give the confidence for colleagues to support the proposal we're making.
Thank you. Just a quick clarification. There wasn't, and it may be a past thing, there used to be an amount that you could transfer without request. Has that changed, Martin?
Yes, so effectively anything up to 0.5% needs forum approval. Anything above 0.5% requires Secretary of State approval. So there's not an amount that we can just move without approval from either party.
Thank you. And apologies for what I'm about to do, because I'm about to make a little bit of a kind of a broadcast. I do apologise, everybody. You're going to have to listen to it for a minute, but I do hope that you'll understand what it means and what I hope it's intended to communicate. Because I went to the F40 group, and I've never actually been before, but it's one of the benefits of being the chair. You get invited to go along. And I went along and I just left absolutely furious, because it was demonstrating just how completely differently Cambridgeshire and counties in those lower funded authorities are treated, and how if we were in a different authority, or at least if we were funded differently, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. So I asked the question of Martin's and Sarah, knowing kind of what the answer would be, but it almost seems sometimes that we spend, the nature of the meeting is Martin presented what was given to us as the contents of our pot. I think I want to register the fact that the contents of the pot are inadequate, and I'm not even certain the pot is the right shape. So it kind of makes things rather difficult, and we're being placed in a terribly invidious position where we're apparently making decisions about whether we will fund those wonderful things that our colleagues have described, from when we're trying to do the things as Helena and others have described, and Nikki, where we're trying to do wonderful things on another side. And that just seems to me that there's no real right answer in any of this. And certainly when colleagues spoke to me about the last time when we were asked to vote about transfers, there was agony in people, because they don't want to not be funding those things, but they don't know how they then can't fund what's happening inside their school. And I think that's just a really unfair position that we're being placed in. I take you back to Martin's excellent tables. And I like the colour as well. I do like colour on a nice table. That 1.6% increase is really, if it's a 0% transfer, is really 1% of that is not funding 1% like we did last year. Our actual uplift is about 0.5, 0.6%. That's it. Now, we all know that we've heard that there's going to be a 2.8% unfunded teacher pay rise. I don't know how any of us think 2.3% is going to be found before we even start talking about then what we want to do with another 0.5%. And I just thought, without that kind of wider context, just pulling out from the bit that we've had to focus on, I hope I can speak on behalf of everybody else here and say it's not reasonable and it's not acceptable what we're being asked to do today, because we all have those ambitions and we're failing to be able to meet them, and the ambitions that are being stated by the DfE, it can't be done on the sorts of money that they're providing us for, and that's why we're having to have long, difficult conversations about things that I don't think there's any positive or right answer to. So, as I say, apologies for a bit of a party political, if you will, or at least a criticism of the fact that we're in this position. But I just feel sometimes we're focused on the minutiae when we really need to look at the bigger picture. So sorry, doesn't really take a response or anything, but hopefully if this is recorded, maybe we can share it with our MPs, because it's not right. I do then have two other kind of observations on the other one, because I realise nobody's mentioned growth policy yet. For me, it's almost, and I should have picked this up in the pre-meeting, there's two different questions there. One is the growth policy and the other one is around the £2 million. And I think they're two slightly separate issues. And Martin, you've already expressed that having looked at things, the 2 million makes sense. The question for me were around growth fund. I have had a couple of schools talk to me about the way in which the admirable intention of not having to apply for growth has occasionally meant communications have fallen through the floor and schools have felt that they may be getting growth funding and then later found that they haven't. Because if you just sit back and wait for the officers to then do the numbers, maybe sometimes it doesn't quite calculate out the way you thought. So I think there's an issue there. It can probably be closed out by better communication, but I just think good intentions has possibly had some unintended consequences. And the other one that seemed a bit strange to me is when I reread it, there's a growth funding panel referred to, but at no point is it ever explained who's on the growth funding panel or how they get to be in that decision-making position. And that feels a little bit weird to me, that we'd be voting through a policy that doesn't actually tell us who's making the decisions at all.
Yeah, apologies for that, Mark. So yeah, just come back on both of those points. So in terms of that, yeah, I'm being made aware of those instances where schools there's lack of communication. So I was actually speaking to place planning earlier this week about that. So that's something we're going to address as part of the process. So it's going to be kind of better communication with schools in that instance to try and avoid that happening in the future. As it stands at the moment, the panel is made up purely of officers from place planning and from finance and from admissions. We then will invite head teacher representatives for certain instances where there are kind of question marks which we can't answer from a kind of an educational perspective, where we would require some sort of head teacher engagement. And that, to be fair, so colleagues on this call have been involved in those and called into those meetings, and I think that's actually worked quite well. So we only called in head teachers where there's been kind of disputes or issues where we've felt we needed that additional advice. I would say in 90% of the cases that we're dealing with, they are pretty straightforward in terms of the numbers, class structures, support the need for growth. It's sometimes those kind of more kind of nuanced areas in terms of where class structures, there's question marks about actually whether schools could restructure in a different way, or whether actual additional classes are needed to facilitate the kind of the borderline increases in pupil numbers, which is where we've called head teachers in. So I'm happy to add something more into the kind of the policy to reflect that, if that would be useful. But I say effectively that's how it works at the current time.
Certainly on the first one, thank you ever so much. And I do think it's admirable that we're not having to fill in loads and loads of forms and you're trying to help us. But I just think, as I say, it fell through. So much appreciated that. On the other one, I think there's something around transparency in the way those decisions are taken. And I think that might be really useful to have forum representation on there, if people would like to. And it's kind of a little bit of a point. From another local authority, they've made it very clear to us and to their forum that the decisions aren't for local officers to be making. They're actually for the members of Forum to be making about whether growth funding is given to particular instances. And I don't know which one is right, to be honest with you. And I have gone back and read it, and I think it's a little bit ambiguous. But I would think if the transparency is there of having Forum members on it, then it doesn't really matter about whether we're meeting the Forum guidance or not.
Our approach has always been that we are applying the guidance approved by Forum, and effectively that's been the kind of the decision making, and hence why when we've had those ones which are borderline, we've called in head teacher for representation to support that. But yeah, I'm happy to pick that up with place planning around the membership and get Forum members involved in that.
It would be great, I think, to ask for if there are any volunteers in here, because I think it'd be really helpful for people to be able to see how those things are being decided upon. It's really instructive, certainly having been in a couple of similar things myself. I learnt an awful lot about how those things operate in other schools. Professional development, it was wonderful. But thank you for that, Martin.
Yep, no problem.
Are there any other questions of what we've done so far? Because if not, we'll move round to considering the recommendations, and I believe, Tamar, you'll probably go through everybody's names as we go through B.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So we'll note the first part. Thank you ever so much, because I know how much work goes into that and the detail. And as Martin shared extra slides, that's because Ryan and myself in the pre-meeting asked for further information we thought would be really useful for colleagues. So the responsiveness of doing that in a short time frame, really massively appreciated. So Schools Forum are asked to approve the proposed growth fund policy to be applied in 25-26 and the centrally retained growth fund of £2 million. If we can take on that, the vote on that. Tamar, do you want to confirm how you want to do that?
Yeah, I'll read out the names. Unless with this one, unless there is any, I think we could do this by show of hands if anyone's against.
Yeah, if you're happy with that.
Yeah, for this one.
Are there any hands? If you can raise them actually virtually as well as physically, because we've got it on screen from Martin at the minute, I'm flicking around the top. I can't see anybody opposing it. So Thank you, Tamar, for saving us all the effort of having to listen to lots of people making the statement. So just as a last chance for anybody who wants to say different, otherwise we'll accept that one as approved.
Yeah, and then I think
Marvellous.
we need for vote C, we need to take a go through the names.
Okay, so just to read it out for the clarification, that if you say approve, then that will mean that you approve the Schools Forum are asked to vote on the approval of a 0.5% or £2.6 million block transfer between the schools block and the high needs block. That's the statement. What would you like people to say if they don't approve it?
So can you please either say for, against or abstain?
Okay, so nice and clear. If you're for this, against, or if you wish to abstain. Thank you, Tamar. If you'd like to take the list.
Yeah, and again, if I pronounce your name wrong, so, apologies in advance. So that's Mary Abaskera.
Abaskera. 4 with the caveats of KPI.
Alison Anderson.
4.
Adrian Ball.
Against.
Christopher Bennett.
4.
Leslie Birch.
4 with the caveats as described earlier.
Alison Bishop.
4.
Yolanda Botham.
No.
Sorry, can you say that again?
4.
4, thank you. Nikki Brown.
Against, because I believe that it implies that we have the capacity in schools to make that transfer.
John Culpin.
4.
Ryan Kelsall.
4.
Peter Law.
4.
Lena Marsh.
Against for the same reasons as Nikki Brown.
Thompson.
Against for the same reasons as Nikki and Helena.
Mark Vickers.
For.
Sorry, won't be a moment. I'm just recording all of these. Charlotte Whistle.
It's all right, Tamar. But I think with the acknowledgement that this is a bit of a last chance saloon, we need to see the impact if we're sat here in 12 months' time without the evidence of the impact of this. I think there will be a significant unwillingness for everybody to commit moving forwards.
Okay, thank you. And Mark Woods.
For. I think everybody's captured beautifully just exactly where we all stand. So thank you.
It's just to check that I don't have Nadine Gooding Herbert or Sasha Howard.
I'm here, Tamar. I arrived late, so I am here.
Sorry, who was that? Sorry.
Nadine.
That was Nadine.
Sorry.
Nadine. Yeah, can I take your vote as well, please, Nadine?
Yeah, so 4, but with the same caveat as Mary, which is the KPIs.
Thank you.
And Tamar, I'm also here, Sasha. I arrived.
Sasha's here. Yeah. And can I take your vote, please, Sasha?
Against.
Thank you, Sasha. Okay. So I'm going to just calculate now. So if you could bear with me for a minute while I do that. Is that okay? So that's 13 for and 5 against, so it's carried.
Thank you, Tamar.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Martin, I believe we're back over to you now to continue with your presentation into the budget proposals for education fundings and de-delegations.
Indeed, thank you. Right, okay, let's move that forward. So education functions, as we referenced at the last meeting, proposal is to continue this at £10 per pupil based on the historic amount that we've always transferred. Likewise, with the delegations, proposal to keep the amounts for contingency, free school meals and maternity at previous levels. The only exception to this will be around trade union facilities time, which we're proposing to increase to £1.20 per pupil. So I'm hoping might be able to kind of actually kill 2 birds with 1 stone here in terms of the next item as well, in terms of the trade union facilities time paper, which is item 6 on the agenda, and we've done some costings around revised estimates based on increasing the levels of facilities time for the smaller unions as set out in that paper. Applied a small uplift to the daily rate, although we recognise that has to be confirmed based on the academy take up, because obviously academies are invoiced for this rather than the de-delegation approach. In the paper, it refers to an additional contingency, and officers are of the view that actually we can fund that contingency outside of this mechanism, so that it's not funded directly from the de-delegation or the amount that is invoiced to schools. So we would suggest that's, as I say, taken and managed separately. Based on that, we're estimating the total facilities time costs for next year just in the region of 89.5 thousand compared to the 80.5 thousand that it is in this current financial year. Hence the proposed increase from £1.10 to £1.20 per pupil. So for maintained primary schools, that would be managed through the de-delegation arrangement, which we would be asking Schools Forum maintained primary representatives to vote on. For academies, it's part of the individual arrangements with individual academies and academies trusts who buy in or don't have their current arrangements with the unions in place in terms of that. So appreciate, I say, that we've kind of added that in because we recognise that there was the kind of the de-delegation question, and then obviously the separate paper on the trade union facilities time as well in terms of the needs for there. And think there is some additional work that we probably need to do. I think in the trade union facilities paper, it does show that there is obviously a range of approaches that the different local authorities take in terms of how much the contributions are from schools as part of their dedelegation arrangements, and obviously that's going to be down to, in some cases, historical arrangements, and equally down to the kind of the buy-in from academies outside of those dedelegation arrangements as well. So I think that was there for information, but as I say, in terms of our proposals, we're proposing a relatively small uplift to £1.20 per pupil for the following year. So when we get to the next slide, obviously we'll be asking maintained primary school representatives to vote on the dedelegations, but it'll be also interesting to get comments from academies on the kind of the wider question around the union facilities time contributions as well.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments first? I'm not seeing anybody saying anything, Martin. If you were hoping for whipping up a storm of commentary on, it's not been successful. I think people have been so engaged in the rest. So we'll move unless I see anybody raising hands. No. Okay, we'll move straight forward. So this is for maintained primary school representatives only. And I believe, Tamar, you're going to ask to check that those colleagues are prepared to approve the list below.
Okay, so Sasha Howard.
I approve, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Nikki Brown.
Yeah, can I just say thank you to Martin for providing the information on this that we were able to take to the CPH forum for the first time. That was really helpful, so I'm happy to approve.
And Kat Thompson.
Yeah, I approve.
Thank you very much. That's all approved. Thank you, Chair.
Superb. Thank you very much indeed. And then we continue into the high needs block.
Sorry, you'll be pleased here. I've only got 14 slides left, so we're getting there. Yeah, high needs block. The basic structure hasn't changed for the high needs funding, which again, going back to earlier conversations, doesn't necessarily help in terms of the allocations that we're getting. As noted previously, the DFE have obviously committed to, and the government have committed to a kind of the wider review of the funding in terms of high needs going forward to ensure that it is fair and equitable going forward. So time will tell in terms of how that actually progresses. There's the separate schools budget grant, which local authorities receive in 3 separate elements, and that's going to be kind of put together for special schools into a separate grant allocation as well. So once we get those allocations in a bit more detail, we'll have a look at exactly how we're going to work that through. And I think Mary and others on the special schools, I think we'll probably need to have a conversation with the special heads around how that funding is going to work in terms of those grant allocations. They keep adding on, baseline the grants, but giving them a separate allocations, which is not particularly clear and transparent when we're trying to review bandings and top up funding for individual special schools going forward in terms of that. Minimum funding guarantee again for special schools is set at 0%. So similarly to mainstream schools, we're looking at minimal uplift in terms of funding compared to the previous year in terms of that. Unfortunately as well, the £10,000 place funding remains at the same level. Again, we've been pushing for that to increase to reflect the significant increases in costs, and it would give certainty to special schools around the funding. But unfortunately, as I say, that is still remained at that £10,000 place level in terms of that. So, and then in terms of the MFG, the top-up funding must be set at a rate to ensure that schools' budget is no lower than it was in 24-25. So again, minimal uplift, and again, you know, as we've already heard from Nikki and others around the pressures on mainstream schools, again, this is a similar situation in specials because of the lack of uplift in funding in the high needs block that we're seeing, which is just continuing to add to those pressures. So this one, there's no decisions to make on the high needs block at the moment in terms of that, but it's just really any comments on that, just to reflect the announcements to date.
Colleagues, any comments? Give you a couple more seconds in case. Mary, I see your hand is up.
Thank you, Mark. Obviously, Martin, it's disappointing that the per place fundings remain the same, and it'd be daft of me to miss the opportunity to just point out the significant increase in costs in special, particularly around specialised equipment and the equipment needed in some cases to keep some of our children actually alive. In some cases, it's not around whether we're providing different resources or a choice of resources. It is the decision to ensure life. And for that reason, that 10,000 place funding really does not reflect the increased costs of equipment that are currently being incurred by our special schools. Thank you.
Yeah, completely recognise that, Mary. And I think, as I say, I think, you know, we need to look at how the kind of the other funding streams through these separate grants can reflect that in terms of that 10,000, as you know, hasn't increased for a number of years since it was introduced. So, you know, a bit like we said about the notional earlier, it's almost becomes an arbitrary figure now in terms of the allocations, because it doesn't reflect the needs that you're incurring.
Perhaps, Martin, you and I have just been around it too long, but it is now an effective cut in funding every time it is maintained at £10,000. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Martin.
So moving on, Central School Services block, nothing really to kind of update on here in terms of the allocations. You've already approved the school admissions and the Servicing of Schools Forum. We're still waiting for the National Copyright Licence arrangements to be confirmed in terms of the funding allocations for that, but that's no impact on schools. As I mentioned earlier, already includes a further 20% reduction in funding for historic commitments in terms of the retained duties. Any changes in the copyright license costs will be managed within that overall budget, so it won't be an impact on individual schools. And again, it means that in most cases schools will not need to negotiate individual licenses as the DFE pays those costs. There were some significant changes to the costs this year, hence on the previous slide the figures, other items in red, that figure went up in year 24-25, and we've received some additional funding from the DFE to cover that. I think there was delays in them renegotiating with some of the licensing agencies, but again, that's no impact for individual schools. So again, that one is just to note and comment on that in case there is anything. So I'll just pause, and if there's I suspect there won't be any questions, but in case there are, I'll just give people a couple of minutes.
You can never be sure, Martin. There could be somebody with a fascination for an item in there that you've not previously appreciated, but it would appear not today. Obviously too cold outside. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. If you want to progress.
Move on. Yep. So on the homeward straight now. So early years budget. So as already mentioned, there's quite a considerable increase in the overall early years block that the local authority is estimated to receive. That figure will flex in year based on actual take up, but what it has resulted in is in the increases in national increases are set out here in terms of the pence per hour for your 2-year-olds, 3- and 4-year-olds, and 9-month 2-year-olds, as well as the early years pupil premium and the disability access fund in terms of that. So they're the national allocations which would have been announced. Early years provider reference group met on Tuesday, and these were the rates that were proposed to those in terms of the increases that were going to be applied for the next financial year, with the comparative rates for the current financial year as well, in terms of that. And I've got some feedback shortly in terms of the kind of from that group. We're also proposing to introduce introduce CENIF funding for the younger age children, kind of in parallel with the current arrangements for 3 and 4 year olds, which is kind of in line with the government requirements. Equally, the maintained nursery school supplement will continue in terms of that. So there's just a summary of what's being proposed there. As I said, early years reference group met on Tuesday, and I'm sure colleagues might want to comment on this, but obviously the principles and priorities as stated there around publishing the rates as soon as possible, maximising the base rate for children, and to support the inclusion of children, which kind of comes back to our earlier discussions as well, and that the early years provider reference group were in support of those proposals. In terms of the process, this will go to Children and Young People's Committee for their approval on Tuesday, as they have the approval around the rates to be applied. So we're hopeful that will be approved, which will mean we can get those rates out confirmed to providers as soon as possible, to allow providers to work on their planning for the next financial year. The thing we need Schools Forum to approve in this meeting is around the centrally retained element of the early years block. Local authorities are allowed to retain a maximum of 4% of the early years funding for retained functions, although they have said they are moving towards 3%, because obviously there's a significant increase in the early years funding, so that 3% is probably in excess of what the 4% would have been worth in previous years because of the overall size of the early years block. There's quite a complex formula in terms of how that applies, in terms of what is included and excluded in that percentage. At the moment, based on the figures that we're proposing, we are well inside that threshold. In terms of that, you'll see there's quite a big increase in terms of the statutory duties figure that we're proposing, but that's reflective of the kind of the 40 to 50% increase in early years block funding generally, and that increased commitment and demand around the extended entitlement and the wraparound provision in terms of the overall figures. So although it looks like a reasonably sized cash increase in terms of percentage terms and an additional increase of the overall early years block, it's a relatively small percentage in terms of that. Other areas are not being proposed to change too much from the previous allocations based on that. We have to, as part, I think it said on the previous slide, is when we do the kind of section 251 budget statement, that will essentially give us the final percentage of what our pass through is, which we can then share with Forum. But as I say, we're well within the thresholds at the moment, and even if the funding does flex because of changes in actual take up, we don't expect that to cause us any problems going into the next year. So again, Schools Forum asked to note and comment on the early years block proposals, and also then to approve the centrally retained funding for 25-26.
Again, thank you very much, Martin, for the clarity of the presentation. I'll just pause. Case Alison, thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to say that the group obviously met on Tuesday, and we approved, all of us unanimously approved the suggestions that have come forward to Schools Forum today. And for us, really, it was about sustainability, because we're moving from the 570 hours to 1,140 hours from September. So it's about sustainability of the sector. We also talked about, Mark, what you were saying made me smile about political broadcast, because it was very much the same kind of discussion that we were having, because there's only a certain amount of money that's given through the funding formulas from the government, and we need to lobby and talk to our MPs and think about that, because actually there's only a certain amount of money within the budget. But we felt that it balanced sustainability, continued to give the funds also for the CENIF, so we agreed it. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I think that's hugely valuable for colleagues ahead of H. Brilliant. No other comments, so we'll note the first one. Tamar, how would you like to proceed in terms of taking this piece?
If you could just ask if there's anyone against.
Yeah, it seemed eminently sensible to me, just to check.
Yep.
I can't see, again, if there's anybody who'd like to object to it, despite Alison's very, very carefully stated approval. I can't see anybody, so I think we'll take that as approved. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, last slide you'll be pleased to hear. So as already mentioned, we're going to CYP committee next week. So sorry, just a quick step back. So based on the decisions that have been made today, I will kind of just rerun the budgets slightly. They effectively, they shouldn't differ too much from the 0.5% figures which have already been circulated, but I'm aware there's a couple of the exceptional premises factor figures might change, and maybe one of the variation to pupil figures might change, but we're talking it will have pounds difference, and I don't think it will even change the formula factor values at all. I'll rerun those figures. They will then go to Children and Young People's Committee on Tuesday for approval. We then have to submit the final figures to the ESFA by the 22nd of January, and I will then aim to circulate the kind of the, if you like, the final draft budgets to schools, a similar timescale to that, so schools can see the kind of the proposed impact for individual school budgets for next year. Obviously, as we always say, all budgets will be draft until the ESA have approved and said that our formula meets their criteria. We quite often get quite a number of technical queries back from them. Very rarely does it change the figures, but there is always a risk that if we have to make a technical change, as Mark's alluded to earlier, you move something in one place, it has a knock-on impact somewhere else. So I always do just say the caveat that until the ESA have given us that approval, figures are still subject to change. And also academy budgets are only going to be illustrative, because obviously the final budgets will be confirmed by the ESFA as part of your GAG statements on an annual basis. And then also we'll then be working on the special school budgets, and I probably should have put early years budgets on here as well, so apologies for that exclusion. Alison, that Dale will be sending out the kind of the obviously the hourly rates will be published, but then we also provide some illustrative budgets for maintained nursery classes, schools and providers as well, in terms of their hourly rates for the different elements. So we'll be working those up as well. So you'll all be very pleased to hear that is me finished now.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to clarify that nobody wants to ask any questions on the next steps, Martin, before we fully release you. No, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, thank you. A number of colleagues have made little comments and etc. about the quality and of support that we have in this decision-making process. Thank you, and for the considerable amount that you've just had to put in and answering the questions. It's really, really helpful in terms of helping us through very difficult decisions. Much appreciated. In terms of the next item, I think we've kind of assumed that we're now going to move straight beyond that, have we? Just to clarify.
Sorry, yeah, unless anyone had any specific questions on it in terms of that, I think we're on the basis of what we've already spoken about, we've kind of agreed that we're going to go with the £1.20, and then we'll do some further review in year once we know what the academy take up is in terms of that, and we'll pick up the contingency as a separate separate funding source for that as and when required. So unless anybody else specifically wants to raise anything on that item, I think we can cover that off if you're happy to do so, Mark.
I am, as long as my colleagues are. I'm not seeing anybody who doesn't. No, good. That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So we'll move on to the seventh item, the high needs block subgroup draft terms of reference. And I believe it'll be you, Sarah, who's going to be presenting that to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've probably talked quite a lot about the objectives of this group. So the terms of reference really are just to set out what we're planning to do within the group. There's been a lot of feedback and discussion today about having greater transparency around some of the financial modelling, and by scheduling that subgroup in advance of the full schools forum, that will give us the space to model some of the proposals that we're bringing to forums, specifically around the debate that we've just had around the development of the ERBs. So we met well, Martin and I met with you as chair and vice chair this week, Mark, and we were proposing that we would use, we had February the 14th set out as the next forum meeting, didn't we? Which I think we're not now going to use. So we were proposing that we make that the subject of the high needs block subgroup, and we can bring some of the information that people have referred to today, and we can have a focus session on the ERB model within that initial meeting. So the paper just sets out the expectations in terms of representation and gives an idea of what we're aiming to do within the group, but it will add rigour and support the proposals that we make at full forum by doing that modelling in advance, and create a forum, I suppose, for greater transparency around some of those decisions and the implications of those decisions. I'll pause there for any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Colleagues? Comments, questions? No, I'm not seeing any. The only one that I made in a discussion with oh, sorry, Helena, I've just seen your hand pop up. Yeah.
Just the minor one, sort of thinking about representation of the group. The draft was circulated and it suggested various representation from CENTIF or etc. I seem to remember on a previous iteration there was the suggestion that a SENCO could be part of the representative group instead of as many heads, but that wasn't on the recent version. So I don't know if that had been a deliberate change.
Oh, I'll update that, Helena. Because I think that is a helpful. We obviously need input from the service and also, you know, that specialism around SENCO. So I think that's probably just been an omission. So I will update it to reflect the SENCO. But I do think we do need it at a senior level. So that might give us some access to more on the ground information, but I do feel that if it's going to help us in some of the more challenging decisions, it is good to have it at that senior level.
Yeah, and it may be there's an overlap because maybe some of the heads being represented on the group are SENCOs themselves, especially from the primary sector. But I think just that lens might be useful as part of that group.
Yeah.
I think to speak to that point, there is an interesting question, to my mind anyway, around who, for example, the primary school representatives are. And that would seem to me to be it's a CPH discussion, just working out where they're going to come from. And that could then meet the criteria you've just described, Helena. It's kind of over to them, isn't it? I know when we were talking it through, there's that balance, isn't there, between truly representative of all the different groups who want to have a voice and then not having 1,000 people sitting around the table so you can't hear what's being said. It's just a constant give and take. So I think it's very important that the primary, secondary and special heads groups are active in this. I wouldn't like to, Yolanda, start to suggest that I understand quite how the further education 19 to 25, I don't quite know how that would work. In terms of that,
can I jump in, Mark?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Just to say that I actually agree with Helena's point. And although it says 19 to 25, actually, you know, further education is actually 16 to 25. And I'm pretty sure that Cambridge Regional College, Long Road, Hills Road, just thinking, and our sixth form colleagues would want to be part of it. It's not something I personally can commit to at the minute, but I would like to try and find somebody, if that's, you know, okay, that would want to serve. And they should, I think, as Helena said, have some lived experience of the, you know, the challenges. Sarah, I don't know if that's something you would.
No, I think it's a really, and I've noted the comments in the chat as well. I mean, we've absolutely got to have post 16 as part of this conversation, haven't we? So they're there as a draft, and I think, as Mark said, for you as your sector representatives to comment, and we'll have the first meeting. And as we progress, also, you know, we're probably going to identify, I think, as Mary said, you know, the medical needs aspect also. So I suppose there is going to be things that come into those discussions, isn't there, as we get it off the ground? So yeah, good comment. and grateful for post-16 support, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena. The other comment I was going to make was I looked at the governance structure at the bottom. I think it was when John and myself and Martin were having a discussion, and I just noted that most of those groups, I don't know who they are, and I don't know who's represented on them. But it wasn't very clear how colleagues in education actually spoke into any of these items, which for me seems to be pretty crucial. I recognise there's lots of other groups in there like the NHS, etc. But whether the voice of the kinds of professionals who are working day to day with young people, like good people around this table here today or virtual table, I think it's really important that those voices come into that. And I couldn't work out, unless I've mistaken, quite where Forum or the High Needs Working Party group is. I can't see them in that. I realise they might not be seen as part of the governance. They could be working in a different way, but it seemed to me that maybe there's a miss there in that table. Really good. And then I realised which bits weren't quite there, but I didn't know what they meant. So I think there's some work that we could do on improving them.
Yeah, and we've had discussions internally around the governance, and I think that there is an opportunity to streamline some of our meetings and have greater clarity around the connectivity. So perhaps that's something that we could look at and share within that high needs block group, because I think we probably overlap a number of meetings with the same people and same objectives as well. So good point, well made. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just taking us back to membership, just looking at the current version of the paper. Can I just push for alternative provision to be on that list, please? It's not currently.
Yes, will do. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. And Nikki?
Can I just check, in terms of the primary heads representation, if the purpose of this group is to propose various models and look at modelling the funding implications, would it be better if the role of Schools Forum is about the accountability against those KPIs? Would it be better to have two separate representatives? In other words, one representative doing the role of the accountability on Schools Forum and another representative doing the modelling work? Or do you see it as more of a benefit to have the same person? Because essentially you're holding yourself to account to a certain degree, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's within your gift to identify who you think is the most appropriate representative, Nikki. But and there's the pros and cons both sides, isn't there? Because the accountability is obviously going to be shaped by understanding the financial implications. So you could look at it whichever way. I mean, I guess what we're proposing is, here's our thoughts on what that representation could look like. It would be for your individual sectors to determine, who is best placed to do that. But it's having that full understanding, really, isn't it, of the of what happens within Schools Forum. That is a skill in itself. So I think it's in your gift to scope, basically.
Yeah. We debated a little bit about whether it should just be a subset of this group, but then hit the problems you were describing, Nikki, but also then talked about how the feedback from that group comes back to this group, because it's very much part of what we're going to be working on. So, yeah, that's why I think it's really important that the relevant sector bodies actually consider how they think it's best done, that it can go both directions. Okay. Don't see any other hands or comments. So members are asked to agree the final terms of reference. Are you happy to agree those terms of reference with the small caveats that we've just made? Please raise your hand if you disagree. Marvellous. Thank you. I think that was perfectly still from all people, almost to the point where I thought my broadband had dropped out. Thank you very much indeed. So that is carried forward. I'm now on to the last bit. I'm just double checking. It's the schools forum to note the agenda plan. Is there anything that you wish to raise on there, Tamar?
No, unless officers have got anything to raise. Obviously not.
No? Smashing. Again, thank you so much, colleagues, for your commitment this morning. I think the professionalism as we work our way through such complex things is a credit to all, as is our daily work with the young people that we serve. So thanks ever so much for that. And good luck with this very cold weekend ahead. Go careful. Take care all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.